Recording is beginning. So I am Shirley Gilbert. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Professor of Modern Jewish History at UCL. I'm also the Academic Director of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre, which was established a few years ago in memory of the late British historian, who was, of course, a very prolific and very widely read historian. He was the official biographer of Sir Winston Churchill, but also published many dozens of books on a wide range of other topics, including the 20th century, the First and Second World Wars, the Holocaust, Israel, the history of the modern Jewish experience, and more. And one of Martin's particular gifts was to be able to speak to public audiences, not just to speak at academic conferences, but really to bring history alive. And so our aim at the center is to perpetuate his legacy by bringing the best historical research to a broad non-academic public, to make it engaging and to make it exciting. So please do join our mailing list if you're not already on our mailing list. I will include a link in the chat in just a little bit when I finish my intro, so that we can let you know about our forthcoming events. And as usual, I will make just a little plug, which is to say that as a small charity, we really rely on donations so that we can keep our events free at the point of access and also reach a wide audience, including many who can't pay for events. And so any contributions you would like to make are always very gratefully received, and it's very easy to donate on our website. So tonight, I'm really delighted to be able to introduce to you Jacqueline Granick, who's really a rising star in the world of historical research. She is a lecturer in modern Jewish history at Cardiff University, and her research expertise lies at the intersection of Jewish history and international politics. Jacqueline obtained her BA at Harvard and her MA and PhD in international history from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. And then after that, she came here to the UK, where she held a Newton International Fellowship and a Rothschild Foundation Hanadiv Europe Fellowship for postdoctoral research at Oxford. And tonight she's going to be talking to us about a subject that she probably spent much of her time in Geneva and Oxford working on, and that's also the subject of her new book, which is titled, as is her talk tonight, International Jewish Humanitarianism in the Age of the Great War. The book was published last June by Cambridge University Press, and I will also put a link in the chat to that, along with a discount code in case you're interested in buying it. So Jacqueline will speak to us for about 40 to 45 minutes. After that, we'll open up the floor as usual for your questions and comments. Feel free to post your questions in the chat, or you're also welcome to ask them in person afterwards. And either way, we ask that you please let us know who you are, so that we can engage a little bit with you and know where your question is coming from. Great, so without further ado, Jacqueline, it is over to you.
Great, thank you. Let me share my screen, so bear with me during the fiddly bit. All right, so hopefully you can see my slides. Yes, great. So thank you so much to Dr. Gilbert and the Gilbert Center for having me this evening and giving me the chance to really share some of my research with a broader audience. I see a lot of familiar faces here too, and names. So thank you to those people, especially for coming to support me. So I'll begin here, and I quote, "One cannot even imagine what hardship the Jews in Eastern Europe have suffered," wrote a youthful Lieutenant James Becker to his parents in Chicago. "Everywhere they have been plundered, driven out, homes destroyed, businesses ruined, until one is obliged to wonder if it ever will be possible to reconstruct these people. Personally, I believe that a large percentage never will be saved or restored to their former position. I'm generally quite optimistic. However, after having been given the chance to see the condition of the Jews in Poland, Galicia, Czechoslovakia, German Austria, Romania, Bessarabia, and Bukovina, you can believe me when I tell you that the burden of war has fallen on an undue and unbelievable proportion of our co-religionists in all parts of Europe. That Lieutenant James Becker was an American-born, upper-middle-class Jewish 25-year-old who was working as a humanitarian delegate for the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, known as the Joint. He was supposed to be organizing humanitarian relief to save millions of European Jews from the ravages of war. He was the closest thing out there to an American Jewish emissary. Nevertheless, it was an overwhelming task of relieving the suffering of Jewish strangers. They were frustrating and quarrelsome at times, unreformed and wholly un-American, and yet these strangers were his own co-religionists, whom he understood to be like several million destitute kin. His was serious business. So this might seem a familiar story, but it was rather unusual. It's not, for example, the story of liberating Nazi death camps, the story which sits at the center of our historical imagination regarding Jewish humanitarianism. It took place a full generation earlier. Nor is it about a hardy white American youth who was off on a humanitarian adventure to feed the hungry children of Europe under future US President Herbert Hoover's aegis. That's the story which defined mainstream American humanitarianism of the moment. So this evening, I will briefly recount this forgotten tale, which I myself have pieced together using thousands of unpublished archival documents filed away in libraries in the US, Jerusalem, New York, Geneva, and elsewhere. This story has much to tell us about the Jewish diaspora and modern international politics, but existed briefly in that particular moment suspended between wars when European Jewry was in crisis but culturally vibrant, when American Jews had just taken on the mantle of Jewish solidarity, and before Israel was an established reality. This is a Jewish story that took place in countless local contexts, but also one entangled in great power and global politics, including America's wartime ascent. So let's start with the war itself. I quote, "The war was a calamity to the world at large. To the Jews, it was a disaster of stupendous proportions." End quote. This assessment of the Great War by historian Abraham Duker was published on the eve of the Second World War. And then, in the inconceivable horror of the Holocaust, the Great War was promptly forgotten, never to be fully excavated. You haven't heard this story before, because it simply hasn't been retained in anyone's collective memory. And I am the one to have exhumed it through exhaustive years of dedicated research. So I emphasize that the Great War sent the Jewish world into a tailspin. On this map of pre-war Europe, you can vividly see the way in which the western edge of Russia abuts the big neighboring German and Austro-Hungarian empires, with the Ottoman Empire just to the south of a few small states. This whole band would comprise the Eastern Front of the war. In 1914, on the eve of the war, out of about 14 million Jews in the world overall, 6 million of them lived in the Russian Empire, long legally confined to that shaded western edge of Russia, called the Pale of Settlement. The Eastern Front thus stretched across the region where the majority of Jews in the world lived at the time. You can see it on this map. From Vilna and Poland to Galicia and Eastern Austria-Hungary, Ukraine, and Romania. Jews also lived throughout the Ottoman Empire, which was also at war. Jewish civilians and soldiers suffered terribly. About 7 million Jews were estimated to bear the brunt of the war's direct violence. Jews were subjected to pogroms, including mass rape, destruction of property, and deportation, all violence directly targeted at Jews, as well as the privations which were affecting all civilians in the war zones, such as hunger, cold, and illness. They were impoverished, displaced, and desperate. Beyond untold deaths, several 100,000 from war-related pogroms alone, the war displaced more than 1 million Jewish refugees, created tens of thousands of Jewish war orphans, awakened intense anti-Jewish violence, and brought about the wholesale destruction of the Jewish market towns known as the shtetl, and with it, a way of life. As European empires self-destructed and were reformed as nation-states, Jews were also caught in the crossfire of the Russian Revolution and Russian Civil War, the Polish-Soviet War, and the fighting and collapse of the Ottoman Empire. This is all merely to summarize in broad terms. You might be shocked to read testimony from this era, some of which is on this slide, especially if you have never thought about the Great War in this way. If you're interested in learning more specifically about the genocidal pogroms in Ukraine, which presaged the Holocaust, you can look up Weidlinger's new book, whose cover is on the screen. Indeed, the Great War and major restructuring of the map and political power in its wake brought the Jewish question into sharp relief from where it had been hanging over European society throughout the previous century. I conceptualize this more as Jewish questions, a series of interrelated, hard-to-resolve issues, all of which fall under a greater question having to do with how Jews were to fit into modern European society. The Balfour Declaration announcing a Jewish national home in British Mandate Palestine, the emancipation of the Jews in revolutionary Russia, and a series of minorities treaties for East Central Europe negotiated as part of the peace of World War I, brought different, possible, sweeping political answers to the Jewish question into existence. So in retrospect, we can see that the Great War era marked a crucial turning point in modern Jewish history, probably second only to the Holocaust. Given that, and its relationship to the Holocaust itself, I find it frankly remarkable how little we hear about it. As European destruction raged, and European charities were themselves engulfed in the war effort, U.S. neutrality during most of the war provided an opportunity for Americans to serve a key wartime role as humanitarians. The familiar story about the significance of American involvement in the war, which has to do with Wilsonianism, self-determination, the peace conference afterwards, and the creation of an ultimately American-less League of Nations, does not include the idea of soft diplomacy or non-state activism or social politics, despite the importance of those things. The war actually promoted the growth of new American civil society organizations, and these organizations took their American visions abroad to help others with the support of the US government, which at that time had nothing like US aid in place. So instead, quasi-governmental humanitarian organizations, such as Herbert Hoover's American Relief Administration and the American Red Cross, and a plethora of civil society organizations, from the Quakers to Smith College to the Rockefeller Foundation to the Near East Relief, they all got involved abroad. And American Jews specifically founded the Joint Distribution Committee, the Joint, to aid Jewish war sufferers. And the Joint positioned itself as part of this plurality of humanitarian war relief organizations. So the Great War marked the beginning of an important relationship in the humanitarian sphere overall, of the US State Department and private American relief organizations, all of which were cooperating to conduct humanitarian relief abroad for the very first time. To move aid in wartime, American Jews, who made up the largest group of Jews in a neutral country at 3 million persons, needed to work with the US government, which was the largest neutral power for most of the war. So cash aid traveled to Jews in the war zones through the US diplomatic pouch and also through family connections. Pre-existing independent Jewish organizations in Central Europe and Russia then delivered the cash and remittances, and US naval ships brought aid past the British blockade to Palestine, where it was distributed around the Ottoman Empire. After the armistice on the Western Front, the United States provided major food aid programs across Central and Eastern Europe. Hoover's American Relief Administration and the American Red Cross rushed into these fragile new nation states, which have become purplish on this map, where violence was ongoing. It's important to remember that this armistice was really just the Western Front. And you might note that this post-First World War map has withstood a century nearly unchanged, which highlights the significance of the Great War for our understanding of nations and politics and everything that has gone with those things for just as long. The programs of these American organizations were aimed largely at children, and they had several political goals besides just altruism, which is perhaps not surprising, such as getting rid of American corn that had been stockpiled during the war, stabilizing Europe, especially in the face of Bolshevism, establishing American scientific practices as the international standard, opening Europe and the Middle East to US business, and finding a way to keep America engaged in the world as the US Congress rejected the League of Nations. So there was no official Marshall Plan like there would be after the next World War, but this semi-official humanitarian effort was in some ways its first deployment. Overall, the Great War was a time of transition for America's expanding role in the world, bridging the 19th and 20th centuries, and that was all largely carried out through semi-official humanitarian actors. So in the immediate aftermath of that armistice, the Joint jumped aboard those American emergency relief efforts, which helped it reach Poland and later Russia, where Jews were in greatest need. American relief workers were deployed around Europe for this task, and that task consisted at first of distributing emergency food relief, medications and sanitary supplies, and clothing to help civilians through harsh winters. So in this image, you can see the Joint shipping kosher beef off from New York on its way to Danzig for distribution by a Joint social worker in Poland. Much like American post-war diplomacy was carried out by the American Relief Administration and through private loans with the tacit and direct support of the US government, Jewish diplomacy was being carried out by the Joint, a private humanitarian association. Modern Jewish philanthropy required both national and international public spheres in order to operate, and the sudden successes of American Jewish philanthropy and diplomacy was contingent not only on the place of American Jews within America, but on America's enlarged role in the world. The Joint paid for fully half of the first shipload of general American humanitarian supplies to reach Poland, the first of a pattern in which it consistently paid significant sums for general humanitarian aid, sums that were in fact on par with many governments, in order to justify and secure its own position alongside more mainstream American overseas projects. So in method, the Joint resembled other American humanitarian organizations. While it may have picked up the Jewish relief mantle from its European organizational brethren, it shared its large-scale, highly organized, business-like approaches to the problem with its non-Jewish American counterparts. The other thing American Jewish humanitarianism shared with its American counterparts, but emphasized specifically, was the philosophy of pluralism. This was an idea and an organizing principle that could seemingly bridge the chasms within Jews and also between Jews and their neighbors. This was an American liberal vision, which internationalized could intersect with and make room for the idea of minority rights and Zionist nationalism centered around Palestine in a way that was palatable to liberal American Jews who were brought up on the guarantee of full civil rights. So, taken together, the war experience and its aftermath completely transformed Jewish life across Europe, the Middle East, and America. And with it, international Jewish political leadership shifted irrevocably across the Atlantic as this disaster of stupendous proportions prompted an unprecedented international aid effort led by American Jews on behalf of their suffering Jewish kin. American Jews sent millions of dollars to Europe and the Near East during the war, and then continued to do so in its wake. While American humanitarian aid in general surely saved lives and provided some measure of stability overall, it's probably its Jewish component that had the greatest long-term impact, which I'll explain. So by 1921, peace was returning to Europe, and the League of Nations was set up in Geneva. The catastrophe seemed to have passed, and the Joint was ready to rehabilitate Europe's Jews before making a quick exit. That same year, however, would bring new crises, pushing Jewish security into the ever-receding distance. Mainstream American organizations did leave Europe in the early 20s as political violence declined, and the continent overall appeared to stabilize. But the Joint stayed. The goals of these other organizations to prevent revolution and feed children seem too short-term and too narrow for the Joint. To reach the Joint's goal of reconstructing Jewish life, more investment was needed. American Jews kept hoping that the situation for Jews elsewhere would get better. But they felt they needed to keep helping because it seemed to become clear that it wouldn't, which was already evident in the economic boycott of Jews in Poland, in the lack of treatment for Jews who contracted typhus, in ongoing refugee expulsions, in numerous clausus restrictions, which prevented Jews from attending university, and pogroms. Unlike other organized Americans, American Jews felt an ongoing duty towards their still suffering Jewish brethren, a responsibility they could not simply ignore. And since the United States did not enter the League of Nations, American Jews had to continue to rely on and advocate for continued American resources overseas so that they could keep up their work, even as they also sought collaborations among local authorities and Jews. So instead of leaving in the autumn of 1920, the Joint instead reconfigured itself to undertake what it hoped would serve as reconstructive and rehabilitative work, which would restore European Jews to their pre-war status and still allow the Joint to liquidate itself within a few short years. So rather than organizing work along geographic lines, which is what had to be done in a wartime context, when geographic lines made all the difference in terms of who was fighting who, the Joint decided to now address issues thematically and systematically. And as the Joint became the only American humanitarians left in the former war zones, American Jews became the face of American humanitarianism overall. So there were 4 prongs of this kind of longer-term rehabilitative social welfare work, which began in earnest in 1921. First, refugee work. Second, child welfare work. Third, medical and public health work. And fourth, economic development work. The Hebrew Sheltering and Immigrant Aid Society, known as HIAS, and also Hadassah, which was the Women's Zionist Organization of America, also took part alongside the Joint in particular fields and places. And besides peer American humanitarian organizations, American Jews did have many overseas Jewish models and potential partners. Since the early 19th century, acculturated Central and West European Jewish elites had been interceding on behalf of suffering Jews living further east, and working with their imperial governments to help build Western-style Jewish schools in colonies around the Mediterranean, and also helping Jews migrate out of the Pale of Settlement, that western edge of Russia. On the eve of the war, these institutions formed a diffuse transnational network across the Mediterranean and Europe that stretched to the Americas and which mixed philanthropic and diplomatic functions. And they had, in the prior half century, generated roughly 3 broad activities to address the Jewish question themselves. The first of which was to try to improve the social and political position of Eastern European Jews where they already lived. The second was providing for the emigration of skilled workers to economically advanced regions. And the third was to try to initiate mass agricultural colonization. So as time went on after the war, the Joint kind of picked up the threads from this pre-war European and Mediterranean Jewish world and reorganized those threads for the new world order. In some cases, restoring European Jewish partners to new working order, or creating entirely new structures to make it all work. And gradually, Jewish Americans left Europe and they turned over their work to local Jews. Here's a map which I created for my book, which actually is, I think, in part based on a map made by Martin Gilbert, as is another one that I think we'll see later. And this is a map of how these institutions developed institutionally. Furthermore, American Jews made ample use of immigrant mutual aid and diaspora networks when it came to relief through organizations called Landsmannschaften, which were immigrant mutual aid societies which were structured around identification with their specific ancestral towns in Europe. Remittances, food packages, child sponsorship, tracing services, purchasing tools for agriculture and industry, and developing a Jewish political economy of cooperatives were all formally incorporated into Jewish humanitarianism in a way that was totally unknown to mainstream humanitarianism at the time. So it blended and scaled up long-standing diaspora and immigrant practices with more formalized and institutionalized transnational interventions. Innovation in remittance and food draft delivery were key to the joint's whole operation from very early on. And convincing other American organizations to take up this model was part of that strategy. So, for example, the Joint was only able to reach Jews in Ukraine with food once Herbert Hoover began accepting American food package remittances to famine-stricken Russia. This famine was one Hoover didn't believe to affect Ukraine until Jews themselves started to rapidly place orders there. In this map, this is the other one based on a Gilbert map, you can see the refugee crisis, which was created by the Eastern Front. The arrows indicate the direction of Jews fleeing as refugees from the war zones along the Eastern Front. Again, more than 1 million people. The Great War marked the most extensive, most rapid geopolitical displacement in Jewish history since late antiquity. And when it came to refugee relief, HIAS, the Joint, plus a loose network of European organizations like the Jewish Colonization Association were invested in the cause. With Friedhof Nansen at the center of the intergovernmental interwar refugee regime, sort of loosely based at the League of Nations, and America closing its borders in an anti-Semitic, xenophobic campaign, Jewish organizations argued over the definitions of refugees and other migrants and tried to devise solutions accordingly. The Joint sought primarily to deflect away attention from refugees. It resolved to treat only refugee crises apart from the rest of its regular relief program. So it was hoping that if it absorbed illegally settled Jewish refugees into its regular programs and didn't talk too much about refugees, somehow refugees would eventually find a way to live in their new places of residence and become permanent there. But HIAS and other migration organizations sought ways to continue to move refugees out of Eastern Europe to safer places, despite the new global migration regime that both created far more paperwork and narrowed the number of immigration places available elsewhere. And HIAS faced significant anti-Semitic pushback as a result, and by the way, continues to do so. The Tree of Life shooter in Pittsburgh in 2018 blamed HIAS. The Jewish Colonization Association, which was based in London and in Paris, also tried to work with the new international organizations in Geneva to create protections, international legal protections, and processes for refugees, but had limited success. So ultimately, the refugee crisis that had its origins in the mass expulsions along the Eastern Front could not be solved. It remained a stubborn human crisis across Europe that persisted into the 1930s as Jewish Great War refugees evolved into a permanently, fundamentally precarious group whose mere debased presence aroused anti-Semitic feeling, and who later could be easily funneled into the machinery of the Holocaust. Meanwhile, deadly typhus disease spread through body lice across still violent Eastern Europe, killing defenseless Jews who frequently rejected invasive military programs which occasionally attempted to delouse them. And various reactive, incoherent international health campaigns were undertaken to prevent the spread of typhus. But they were more concerned with cordoning typhus off from the West than with compassionately treating typhus where it was already epidemic. Some of these ideas might make sense to you, given that we're living through this pandemic, when you think about the ways that borders kind of have been quickly closing, and we seem to care more about keeping it out sometimes than helping the people who are actually suffering. And the joint attempted to coordinate amongst various organizations and make them more sensitive to Jewish needs, but basically failed when it was trying to do so. However, Jewish reactions to this failure resulted in the establishment of a variety of autonomous Jewish health programs. So Jewish public health initiatives actually flourished, with American Jews, including Hadassah, acting as the connective bridge from pre-war years. And these programs allowed Jews to try to reconstruct and even seek to improve their status through incremental change, and didn't require state sanction. Furthermore, medicine was uncontroversial and non-politicized within Jewish communities, and Jewish health professionals were relatively abundant. So unlike battling epidemic disease, which required governmental collaboration, which was very difficult to achieve, what I call social medicine, sort of the same idea as public health, could work as a form of apolitical resistance to oppression. This was accomplished partially through the exportation of American nursing practices to Poland and to Palestine. And just on this slide, you can see how Hadassah nurses and the American Red Cross depicted are presented very similarly through shared uniform type, exchanging the cross for a Jewish star. The Joint cooperated with other American organizations to feed Jewish children after the armistice, and this went far more successfully than with regards to public health. However, feeding was only a small part of helping Jewish children who had survived the war, tens of thousands of whom were orphaned, grow up. The Joint attempted to address war orphans by subsidizing them individually, but keeping them placed within local settings and within programs which were designed for all Jewish children, and eventually set up a child sponsorship scheme to increase funds for the issue. What it refused to do was organize child transfers beyond arranging some family reunions. I want to play a short clip of music called Shomer Israel, O Guardian of Israel. The text is part of Jewish weekday liturgy, but here the music is composed and recorded by celebrity cantor Joseph Rosenblatt to raise money for Jewish war orphans. It was created for cultural life in the home, and perhaps in Jewish communal spaces, connecting the individual family, the Jewish community, a celebrity Orthodox cantor, a modern American Jewish Humanitarian Association, the Jewish liturgical tradition and transformation, and suffering Jewish children in Europe and Palestine. Let me play it. O guardian of Israel, save the remnants of Israel, sang Rosenblatt in Hebrew. But who was the guardian of Jews in this turbulent time? If the guardian of Israel could not intervene from on high to help the child remnants, the answer could only be American Jews. Jews were always concerned about the Jewish future and thus with children. These future-oriented worries manifested in heated Jewish debates in Europe and in America over the right way to bring up Jewish children post-war. American Jewish organizations could only achieve so much in terms of exporting progressive child welfare schemes to Poland, though it was easier for Palestine. The vision of child welfare and self-help promoted by American Jewish child welfare experts also depended on an improving economy and the related ability of local Jews to absorb initiatives which had been begun by American Jews. And when such improvements failed to materialize, the Joint felt morally obliged to continue its work, constructing a social welfare system that, in many ways, aspired to that of a social welfare state. The adorable images of children on the slide, which at the top main image is in Poland, sunning at a joint-funded summer colony, which was run by a new Polish Jewish children's health organization that the Joint had helped create. In the corner at top, that's on an agricultural colony in Ukraine. And at the bottom, that's an infant welfare center in Jerusalem. These demonstrate how far the Joint departed from mere food provision, really deepening its involvement in Jewish society and in the future generation over the course of the 20s. The culmination of an ambitious and entirely unique campaign to make humanitarianism self-sufficient, comprehensive Reconstruction work became the focus of and heir to all previous international Jewish social welfare work. Let me play this film, which is like this amazing little glimpse into the past. This was a humanitarian response to Jewish impoverishment as a result of war. But it also addressed the wartime acceleration of a long-standing Jewish economic crisis in Eastern Europe, an economic crisis that had prompted Jews to leave Eastern Europe. Superimposing American wealth and progressivism onto long-standing Jewish self-help ideology, pre-war vocational training, housing construction, and agricultural colonization were all revived. Especially in the Soviet Union, they were expanded by an ambitious new program called the Agro-Joint, which seemed to be the best way forward for Soviet Jews after the Bolshevik Revolution. So in this little glimpse into the past, you can see the revival of long-standing Jewish self-help efforts to productivize Jews, and especially youth, via philanthropy. And crucially, this Reconstruction program also involved the creation of 2 American Western European foundations to foster Jewish microlending and cooperative systems in Eastern Europe and Palestine. The tools of liberal international finance, immigrant banking, and revolutionary cooperative banking met here. The Joint's understated political ambitions lay in building an international, centralized, Jewish cooperative banking system. The first ambition was to bring together the fractured and dispersed Jewish world by transnationally interlinking its economy, institutionalizing its ethnic separateness from other political economies. The second ambition was to create a self-sustaining, pluralist, cooperative social system to carry out this work indefinitely. Non-Jewish humanitarians of the era dared not go into this territory, but also no previous Jewish organizations had attempted such a thing. So Jewish Reconstruction in this period sat somewhere between what we might think of today as state social welfare and international development. I have come to see that American Jewish humanitarian activity abroad mimicked the social welfare activity of early 20th century Western states. Intended first to provide relief until Jews in the East could reestablish themselves, American Jewish organizations instead saw the continued precariousness of Jewish life. The dispersed Jewish people, who might have at first placed trust and hope in their new states and the League of Nations to guarantee their security, had turned to other options by the early 1920s. They had turned to their own diaspora. Although the Joint's American employees had nearly all left Europe by 1923, the Joint had not actually turned over its work to locals. While many old European Jewish organizations the Joint had helped reshape for the New World Order were in fact capable of carrying out Jewish social activities, which demonstrated the significant successes of American Jewish reconstructive work, they were still impoverished. They were still struggling against economic recession. And children, especially, held the Joint's attention, and it was their economic future at stake. Thereafter, the Joint continued to dole out money, mainly for the purposes of childcare, for loan institutions, for medical work, and the occasional refugee crisis. And Jewish philanthropy then came to redefine many aspects of modern Jewish life across Europe and the Middle East in the interwar period, replacing political rights with food, education, healthcare, vocational training, and cooperative banking. From the beginning of its existence in 1914 to 1931, the Joint disbursed more than $80 million, which today would be equivalent to well over $1 billion. The hope was that an international, low-interest, small-loan Jewish banking system would keep the heart of the Jewish world running without too much continued input from American Jews at large, beyond an occasional infusion of financier funding and management. Eventually, the Joint came to aspire to a system for redistributing wealth, resources, and responsibility among Jews and providing a net for the weak, no matter where they lived, and had recognized their own responsibility in sustaining that system. Like all Jewish life, the International Social Welfare Network, with the Joint as its guardian, was fundamentally characterized by its diaspora dimension. To conclude, American Jewish humanitarians looked inward and outward, backward and forward, locally and internationally. They joined America's expanding state at that critical juncture of the Great War and used that relationship to provide a humanitarian response that continued in an unbroken chain far into peacetime and then back into war. The Joint sought to fill the vacuum of governance in recent war zones, not with international government, not with sovereign state government, but by developing and creating links across Jewish civil society itself. This story describes a modern world in which the Jewish diaspora ran its own affairs across vast geographic distances, rather than through territorial settlement. This world is a mosaic of Jewish humanitarian projects and organizations, with the Joint as its connective thread. In this world, Palestine is a cultural center, one Jewish hub among America, East Central Europe, and Russia. But the project was ultimately defenseless, dependent on international forces beyond Jewish reach, and unable to transcend the 19th century Jewish Enlightenment solutions of self-help and intercession. American Jews were not naive about the limits of their abilities to solve the Jewish question by carrying out a humanitarian turned international development project across Eastern Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. As one joint worker said, I quote, It would be a ridiculous contention to claim that any single measure could untie the complex agglomeration of economic, social, political, and cultural knots that go to make up the so-called Jewish problem. End quote. Yet, there were few alternatives. A worldwide financial depression and the rise of fascism radically reshaped Jewish humanitarianism after 1929 and would soon tragically expose its vulnerability. Thank you. Here's a slide about that kind of gives some suggestions for things I could talk more about, and you can ask me about if you want some ideas for where to go with your questions. I'll leave that up for a little bit. And yeah, I'm ready to hear from you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Jacqueline, for a really terrific talk, a really fascinating look at this relatively under-researched period in modern Jewish history. And it always strikes me, as you said, how much the language that's used to describe what was happening to Jews in the Eastern War Zone sounds like descriptions that we nowadays associate with the Holocaust. And it's fascinating to remove the hindsight and think about how it was conceived by Jews at the time. While people digest the possible questions or areas to ask about, I wonder if I can start off and ask about how this huge, sorry, I'm just going to mute other noises, how this huge Jewish humanitarian effort helped to shape the power balance or interrelations within the Jewish world, and how this particular humanitarian project helps to shape what must already have been a shifting power balance among Jews, between Eastern Europe and the United States, in the wake of the big migrations. To what extent it helped cement an American dominance in the Jewish world is mostly what I'm thinking about. And I'm kind of looking at this development work and thinking more broadly about the challenges that development work always brings with it. I mean, doing wonderful things for people who are suffering, but also a kind of power relationship. And maybe if you could say a little bit about what this means for relations between American and European Jews.
Yeah. So I think that most people kind of think about the Holocaust and they think, well, American Jews were somehow already really important on the international scene, right? All of these organizations, the Joint, they already exist. They're already doing things. I mean, they're not so successful in many ways at they didn't save 6 million people in the Holocaust, but everyone kind of, I think, realizes that America is sort of this outside Jewish powerhouse, but nobody really thinks kind of like, where did that come from? And so I think one of the major things I'm arguing is that it came from this, that prior to World War I, American Jews really were not looking outside of America. They were focused on developing American Jews within America, helping new immigrants and so on, but they had very little going on outside of America, other than kind of immigrant relationships with their families and sending remittances back home, but not really institutionally. And it's really at this moment where American Jews kind of suddenly realize that they're a major community and the only one that's not completely embroiled in the war itself. And they step up. And that, I think, completely shifts the course of the kind of big picture Jewish history, because they create all these new organizations. They start really thinking about Jews elsewhere. And it's these things that are created, this kind of institutional inertia, that's what they enter the Holocaust with. And like, one of the things that I found fascinating is if you look at any interwar, or even Holocaust kind of materials in the Jewish world, the joint is ubiquitous. It's in every single story. It's everywhere. And that's one of the reasons why I think it actually really makes sense that I could sort of say that in some ways the joint felt state-like, because it's like Eastern European Jews just sort of had already decided that this was kind of there was some kind of greater thing out there responsible for them and their welfare. It was called the joint. And they could complain about the joint and fight about the joint, but like it was there and they were like debating the terms of it rather than being surprised at its existence. So, yeah, I mean, at the very beginning of all this, in the Great War itself, there was a lot of fighting, and it never completely disappeared, about like how the joint should be organized and how much control the donors should have over what happened versus the recipients versus the intermediary organizations. And that was just an ongoing thing in the background of all of this, that there was just so much friction and contention and fighting over what should happen with this money. But basically, the joint very much stuck to this principle of pluralism and basically said, unless you work together, you don't get the money. So it kind of forced people to kind of work together, and which itself was like a fascinating new development, because prior to the war, there was a lot of factionalism in Eastern European Jewish life, and there was no one trying to get them working together. So it could like really shifted Jewish politics in many ways, both very local and much broader, like really enabling Jewish medical doctors and social workers and kind of these new professions to take leadership positions in Eastern European Jewish life, whereas beforehand probably only kind of businessmen and rabbis would have been Jewish leaders in various contexts. So yeah, it changed all kinds of things. And the area where you see the relationship as actually the hardest is over this question of what to do with children. How do we raise the next generation? With that, I will end there. You can ask me more questions to follow up on that answer if you would like.
Great. So there are a number of questions in the chat, and I see that Tony Samuel also has his hand up. I'm going to start with one question from the chat, and then Tony, I will come to you, and then I'll ask some more questions from the chat. So Stephen Sells, and I hope I'm pronouncing your surname right, says, I have a copy of the American Jewish Committee's The Jews in the Eastern War Zone, which was published in 1916. And actually, you had a quote from that, didn't you, Jacqueline, on one of your slides?
Yeah.
It's an extraordinary little book, which describes what's happening to the Jews on the Eastern War Zone. And he says there, the AJC's officers were Louis Marshall, Cyrus Adler, Judah Magnus, Julius Rosenwald, Jacob Schipp, Oscar Strauss, Cyrus and Mayer Salzberger, among others. Were these notables also on the Joints board? And did Louis Brandeis get involved in post-war work?
Yes. So the reason the joint was called the joint, that's kind of a mysterious name. It's not a word that normally appears in Jewish organizations, this word joint. The reason it was called joint was because in 1914, as American Jews kind of looked around and realized they were like the biggest group of Jews standing in the war, they tried to figure out how they were going to respond, and essentially coalesced into three different Jewish organizations, one of which was the AJC, the American Jewish Committee, and its kind of elite Jewish professionals and bankers who had previously styled themselves the leaders of American Jews. Then there was sort of separately an Orthodox religious organization called the Central Relief Committee. And then there was third, an organization that was kind of socialist, but also professionals who were like less wealthy and often kind of first generation immigrants. And that was called the People's Relief Committee. And I see, because somebody also asked about women, the National Council of Jewish Women in the US tried to also get in on this and were not allowed. So the three other organizations who styled themselves all of American Jewry, basically represented, came together and created this thing, which was called the Joint Distribution Committee. And it literally was at the beginning exactly what the organization's name says it does. It was meant to be this kind of umbrella organization that would coordinate amongst these three different major groups in American Jewish life and get the funds where they needed to go. So indeed, the American Jewish Committee was a very important part of the Joint Distribution Committee. And actually, as time went on, became more and more the entirety of the Joint Distribution Committee, but in its early years, it really was joint, so that these kind of men were only like a third of the Joint's people. And but they all stayed in it a very long time, were really important in American Jewish life generally, and in the Joint specifically. They tried to keep the American Jewish Committee and the Joint Distribution Committee like separate, because they didn't want to be seen as doing politics and humanitarianism at the same time, so they tried to institutionally separate them, even though they were mostly the same people. And Louis Brandeis, though, was not especially involved. No, he was much more involved in kind of Zionist efforts that went along with the Balfour Declaration from an American point of view, which was connected to this project. But he never particularly got involved in the Joint from what I saw, but his ideas were really influential. And I think one way that his ideas were really influential was that he had this kind of idea of a Palestine which would be, for Jews, almost like America, kind of like a Western style liberal Jewish state that would be the city upon the hill that America itself kind of strove to be. And I would say the Joint took this kind of liberal vision and actually tried to apply it to everywhere in the Jewish world, rather than it being specifically about a Zionist project. So the Joint tried to do the same things in Poland, and in Ukraine. But I think that idea of this kind of what American progressive Judaism could bring to the rest of the Jewish world was very much a kind of Brandeisian idea. Next
Thank
question.
you. Tony, please go ahead.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes, you are.
I do know Jacqueline, so I should say that. And I had the pleasure of reading this book a couple of months ago. It's wonderful, and I'd encourage people to buy it. Take a look. It's most interesting. I want to make two very quick observations and then ask Jacqueline one quick question. One observation, Jacqueline knows I worked for a while with World Jewish Relief, which in Britain is a Jewish philanthropic organization. And I can't tell you, the close connections with the Joint to this very day are remarkable. I didn't know about the Joint, I'd not heard of them. But the moment you enter the doors of World Jewish Relief, you get to hear about the Joint all the time, because they continue to do incredible work in Eastern Europe. Point number two, I spent many years in fundraising for a range of charities, but there's a lovely truism which says, people give to people. And sometimes fundraisers get very caught up in wonderful causes, and they'll talk about ideals or ethics or different things that a fundraiser will want to talk about. But deep down, it's the personal story that really cuts through. And of course, thinking about these stories and the American response, these were stories that the American Jewish population knew very well. I mean, their own families would have come from these towns, shtetls, cities. They knew the landscape. So I think the way in which these stories were personalized and the personal stories came through would really have touched the hearts of anyone seeing and hearing these stories. So those are two observations. I want to ask Jacqueline, it's a bit unfair to ask a historian sort of counterfactual question, which I believe is the correct term, because it begs so many questions about what if, and if such and such had happened. But it's pretty tragic that America didn't join or formally sort of get behind the League of Nations. I know Woodrow Wilson was very keen, and but it never happened. America didn't get behind the League of Nations, and of course we all know that it sort of fell apart, I think, in the end. But never. What might have happened if America had been, if the League of Nations had really stepped up?
I guess I can answer that best in terms of like humanitarian relief. I mean, it's an interesting question. The League of Nations did coordinate its own humanitarian projects. And in the 20s, they kind of went okay, for some people. I mean, they were kind of the seat of organization. Like there was sort of proto World Health Organization, which was the League of Nations Health Section, and you know they were trying to kind of work on this typhus campaign. I think that I mean, when people study the League at all, because it's not part of any national history, so it tends to be the case that like very few people learn very much about the League of Nations or the United Nations. Um, but when they do, they really think, especially for the League of Nations, about kind of the big diplomatic questions and kind of could the League of Nations have prevented the invasion of Ethiopia and then German, the rise of fascist Germany and things like that. But like all of the organizations that in the UN system are now kind of separate organizations were all had its origins in the League of Nations, and they all started out as like sections of the League of Nations. The health section, there was a finance section, there was a social issue section, there was the refugee commission, there was a like whole kind of pacifist and disarmament thing going on. There were all these different, the standards organization was already there. So there were all kinds of things going on, and it provided a really useful coordinating point. But just as the UN can't actually do more than just kind of coordinate now and kind of say countries should do more of this if possible, like the League couldn't either. And it's not clear to me that like the US being part of it, and the US as part of the United Nations, would have done terribly much. It might have in fact meant that the US thought it should do even less humanitarian things, because they could just rely on the League of Nations to do it. And instead, it became doing humanitarian work became an important U.S. diplomatic strategy to kind of win support for the U.S. And it helped it on its global ascension. It just went it alone. So I don't know. I don't know what it would have taken for kind of the League to actually step up. I think there's sort of a fundamental problem with the idea of international organizations and expectations of them to kind of prevent states from doing anything too terribly. But what they can do is kind of create norms and standards and coordination, and not necessarily much more than that.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jacqueline. So we have quite a few more questions in the chat. Some of them have come to me directly. Thank you for those. And Nick also has his hand up. So again, I'm going to just alternate. Let me just read you a couple of questions from the chat, Jacqueline, and take them together. First, Taffy Gould asks, what was the source of wealth of the humanitarian American Jews? And Nick Shire, and I can't see the end of the surname here in the chat, but asks, how conspicuous was the effort on behalf of the Jews, and did it arouse resentment among the general population?
Yeah. So the source of wealth of the humanitarian efforts of American Jews, well, it wasn't singular. So first of all, American Jews, there were like 3 million American Jews. So collectively, that was a lot of people to be able to pull from. And American Jews were doing okay in an American economy. The American economy boomed after World War I. So until 1929, which is kind of was part of the Joint's problem. So American Jews were doing all right. It was partly funded by the kind of New York American Jewish banker financier type. And that was kind of a source that sort of could be relied upon, but was not everything. So one of the most interesting things is that within, I think like by the end of the war, the Joint had built up the kind of the first American Jewish fundraising campaign and organization through the Joint. Never before had American Jews as a whole been called upon to like do anything collectively. It had always just been various self-appointed people who had just kind of done something, or immigrants sending their own money back home. But the Joint kind of really organized. American Jewish women were a huge part of this, like local level, and through Hadassah, doing a lot of fundraising. And then also those separate committees, the People's Relief Committee, the Central Relief Committee, doing their own work in the Jewish socialist places and in synagogues across the country, asking people to donate over and over and over again through it, connecting it with Jewish ritual and Jewish holidays. And then there was the remittances that, like, rather than individuals sending over bits of money just through banks, they did it through the Joint Distribution Committee, because they couldn't just do it through banks, because banks were like broken. They couldn't function across enemy lines, but the Joint could. So immigrants were putting stuff through. So like it was really a big project. And at some point, I think during the war itself, the Joint remarks on the fact that the amount of money coming into the Joint from American Jews is actually more is coming from everywhere outside of New York than just New York. So that suggests that since almost all of the financiers were in New York, that was like less than half, maybe significantly less than half of the money coming in. I didn't do a very detailed study of fundraising. It could be its own book on its own, because I think that the fundraising is kind of what led to the whole institutionalization of American Judaism at large. So I think it's a really, really interesting question, but one that I just couldn't spend too much time tracking because I was trying to figure out what the Joint actually did abroad. And the second question, Nick Shire-Feldman's question, how conspicuous was the effort on behalf of Jews? This is a really good question. So yes, it aroused resentment amongst the general population. It did, and the Joint was aware that this could happen. And so another thing that was really different between the Joint and other humanitarian organizations was the Joint was the only organization that was constantly like looking over its shoulder to see, like, is there anti-Semitism there? Like, what should we do? How do we provide aid to Jews without creating more anti-Semitism? This was a question that they were grappling with constantly, every day, at every level. So many of their decisions ultimately come down to trying to figure out this question that none of us still can answer, which is like, what creates anti-Semitism? What creates resentment? What reduces it? What can we do? So one of the things that they tried to do to reduce anti-Semitism or resentment amongst the general population was they tried to organize aid programs by region rather than by Jews. So if there was a city or a town that was like had a significant Jewish population, they would provide aid not to the Jews of that town, but to the town. And they chose the towns based on the towns that had a lot of Jews, but everybody in the town would feel the good effects of the humanitarian relief. And so they would sort of say, they would like emblazon their cars and their offices with like American Jewish relief, and then invite all the townspeople to come and share in this relief, not just the Jews. And there was a lot of fighting about this because a lot of the Jews had like just recently been attacked by people who they were living amongst, and they didn't want to provide or have Jews providing aid to their attackers. But ultimately, this was like in the majority of places, this was kind of a strategy that they kind of provided town aid, or they worked with the American Relief Administration, who was helping all children, and they just made sure that in the American Relief Administration's programs that Jews were included in those programs, and they tried to kind of work together so that Jews would be helped, but they wouldn't stand out. But yeah, I think increasingly over time, it was more and more conspicuous because other Americans left, and you basically only had American Jews there. And so, and sometimes they leaned into it, and sometimes they kind of tried to hide and just be like, we are American, we are not Jews. It depended on the context, but it was something that they were constantly thinking about.
Thanks, Jacqueline. So I'm very conscious of the time, and there are lots of questions, so I must apologize that we're not going to be able to get through all of them, but I will let one last question be asked from Nick, who's been waiting patiently. So Nick, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Okay, thank you. You mentioned the refugees from the Eastern Front in the First World War, that the Eastern Front ran through the Pale of Settlement, and I believe that almost one day to the next, large numbers of Jews were compelled to go to Siberia, and you had a map that showed that. And you said it was difficult to help them. I wonder if there was any help at all provided to them. And if so, in the post-war period, how was that possible, given that there was then a Bolshevik government? I mean, isn't it a bit surprising that the Bolshevik government should have been prepared to have US groups operating in its territory? Perhaps that's a more general question, actually. And just a kind of second question briefly, if I may, and that is as to whether you have any views as to why the pogroms in the Ukraine from 1918 to 21, which you referred to, and you referred to the new book by Weidlinger on that subject. Do you have any views as to why they did not also spread to the Baltic states?
Okay, so the first question, how did the joint reach, you're basically asking, how did the joint reach the Soviet Union? Or are you asking about refugees, or both? Specifically refugees in Siberia?
I suppose I'm kind of particularly intrigued as to how it was that a Bolshevik government allowed American groups to operate in its territory during the First World War.
Yeah.
And as a sort of connected question to that, whether, if you know, whether it was possible to provide any support to the refugees from, who were required to move, away from the Eastern Front.
Yeah.
Or notice.
So I guess the first thing to note is that, like, starting in around 1909, like a few years before the First World War, Russian Jews started to create their own kind of social welfare organizations at a kind of Russia-wide level. They were based in St. Petersburg and led by business and educated Jewish elite. And when the war broke out, those elite contacted American Jews and were able to kind of, and created, actually, of all different Jewish groups pre-existing in Europe prior to the Bolshevik Revolution. Prior to the revolution, but in World War I, Russian Jewry had kind of the strongest self-operating humanitarian aid system. They created this organization whose acronym was ECOPO. And ECOPO was basically took doctors and social workers and deployed them into any parts of territory that Russia was occupying, got permission from the Russian government. The main thing is that they got funding from American Jews to do some of that, that they couldn't, because there was a huge amount of funding required. And American funding allowed them to help Jews who were not, who had like crossed across the border, who were considered enemy citizens because they were not like Russian born. So mostly Jews who were living in the far east of Austria-Hungary. When they like got the line crossed over them, American Jewish money was allowed to be used to help them, because that was like also foreign money. Very strange. So Russian Jews were basically doing it themselves before the Russian Revolution with American funding that helped, especially these enemy citizens. And then the revolution happened, and this actually, a repeated pattern happened. As I said, these kind of tracks where the joint figures out how to do stuff in war. This happened again in World War II, in different places. But basically, that organization ECOPO was able to borrow against the joint within Russia to keep funding stuff, even though it couldn't actually regularly communicate and get money from the joint. The joint, meanwhile, set aside millions and millions of dollars in this kind of chest to repay whatever was going to have to be repaid at the end. And yeah, they just said, like, we have the backing of this, they just borrowed against it. They somehow managed to borrow against it and keep going for a while. And then that stopped being allowed. And then there was a couple of years where basically no aid really could reach Soviet Jews. A joint person was able to get into Siberia. There was like an American incursion from the Far East into Siberia, and he was able to kind of go with that a little bit into Siberia. And the joint kept deploying social workers to like the Soviet border along Ukraine and Poland area to see if they could like literally just kind of break through. They also tried via the Black Sea to see if they could like get into Odessa. They basically just kept trying to send people and to see what would happen, and to see if they could get in. And eventually they did get in, and they were the first American organization, some told, to kind of create a treaty with the new Soviet government. It's like a very little known story. They had this treaty, and the Soviets kind of were using it cynically to try to, like, they thought Jews controlled America. So they were like, this is great. This gets us access to the US government. And Jews were like, this gets us access to suffering Jews. So it kind of worked. The US government wasn't very happy about it. Never that much money was actually sent because the relationship was so tenuous. And then when it really got started for real was when there was a famine in Russia, and Herbert Hoover was invited to help with the famine. And the joint just was like, this is our opportunity. They went in, and once they had established themselves with Hoover left after about a year, and the joint just never left Soviet Russia, was in Soviet Russia throughout the Soviet Union, continued throughout all of Soviet history to be this kind of thorn in the side of, like, the Soviet Union went through many phases of trying to kick the joint out, letting them back in. There was something called the Doctor's Plot, that there was this anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that was basically about the joint. I mean, it was never a settled relationship, but they were able to do some stuff, never as much as they wanted to. It's very complicated and difficult to explain. There are some books that are specifically dedicated to the joint and Russia, which I can recommend if you'd like me to. I can write that in the chat.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And I'm sorry again to those several of you whose excellent questions still remain to be answered, but I will pass them on to Jacqueline. We'll send her a copy of the chat. And I would just like to use this opportunity to say thank you again on behalf of all of us and on behalf of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre. Thank you, Jacqueline, for a really terrific, engaging talk, and all the questions, I think, are testament to how much rich material you gave us to chew on. A reminder that Jacqueline's book is available for purchase, and thank you, Tony, for that lovely plug you gave earlier. A reminder to all of you of some upcoming events that we have. We have an event on Thursday night. Lady Esther Gilbert, Sir Martin's widow, is going to be giving one of her ever popular talks. She's going to be doing some readings from Martin's work on the Wannsee Conference. It will be the 80th anniversary of the Wannsee Conference on Thursday. And next Tuesday, the 25th of January, we have a panel discussion on the Holocaust in public to think about questions around public education and commemoration. So both of those should be really excellent. Please do register to book your place. And yes, I'll end by just saying a big thank you again to Jacqueline. Thank you all for joining us, and hope to see you at one of our events again soon. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Bye.